Hi and welcome back. This is Gmax 1.2 for the beginning modeler, video number 36, the topic of which is aircraft config data. And our objective here is to show you how to transfer Gmax data to the aircraft config for exact data placement. And my name is Milton Shupe, and we're here continuing the video tutorial series now that we've finished the exterior model and have gear added with suspension and everything in place. It's time to get serious about setting up the aircraft config file, and what I'd like to do is to show you how to copy your data directly from Gmax to your aircraft config, so you'll have accurate data throughout the config, which is key to its weight and balance and performance and appearance in flight sim. So assuming that things are set up and some basic assumptions are made, let's take a look at the top view here with the T key. Notice laterally, of course, we want the aircraft placed center line, which it is, as you can see here. And if you look at the exterior node, you'll notice that it is placed at 0, 0, and 0. So that's a must-have. At least in our case, this is the way we're going to do it to keep it simple and keep everything kind of easy to, just from a glance, to see that our data is correct. So with that, let's go to the right view, and we'll also pull up that show you that the exterior node is placed as it should be. And also remember that the grab this and pull it over. That the I got things going on here in the background that's throwing my mind off. That the local coordinate for the exterior node is where it should be and placed, positioned as it should be, with center to the object and aligned to world. And if you look at the local axis, you'll notice that the x-axis is pointing to the right, and the y-axis is pointing forward, and z is up. That's centered and aligned with the world, and that's the way that must be for the exterior node. Let's just kill that tab panel to give us more room here. When you I'm flipping this command panel off and on here with the 3 key, just FYI. Okay, back to the right side and zoom in with I still have the exterior node selected, so it's zooming in on that bad boy. Okay, and you notice vertically we have the aircraft positioned with the center of thrust just slightly above the Gmax line here, and that's usually what I do. It's on or slightly above, so that in the event of a stall, full power on will tend to push the nose down a little bit, just slightly. But you don't want to go too far, otherwise you have trouble rotating your aircraft on takeoff. So at or slightly above, 1 or 2 inches, depending on the size of the aircraft, of course. So with the aircraft exterior completed, now we want to set up our aircraft config with the appropriate data. And so how do you do that? Say, for example, I actually do most of my design work using meters, but regardless of what you use, because the aircraft config uses decimal feet, you'll want to go to unit setup, so customize unit setup, and make sure that if you're on metric or whatever other standard you're using, change it to US standard and decimal feet. This only displays the display, changes the display down here to that unit of measurement. Doesn't change the system unit scale. This is simply the viewing unit scale and your working unit scale. So make sure that's changed to decimal feet. And now we know that when we select an item, we'll get coordinates that are in decimal feet, which will agree with the aircraft config use of those numbers. So that's the unit setup we wanted to talk about. Gmax coordinates display here. You'll notice they're X, Y, Z coordinates. Well, in the aircraft config, they are Y, X, and Z. So Y, X, and Z, as you see at the bottom of Gmax. So it can be a little confusing. You can get your hands crossed here if you're not careful. But after a while, it's just a habit. In the aircraft config, the numbers are always fore aft. Drop down here to say I point, or fore aft, left, right, and up, down. So fore aft, left, right, up, down in Gmax. So a little bit of difference there. So you have to be careful. Don't get your hands crossed when you're copying and pasting these numbers over here. And I do it one at a time, of course. So that's the way you go about doing that. Okay. Secondly, how do we get proper coordinates in Gmax? It's usually pretty easy. All you have to do is zoom in on something you want, like the tire here. And let's pull up the command panel so I can get into vertex subobject mode. And you select the vertex like at the bottom of the tire, in the center of the tire. And now you have the coordinates, the XYZ coordinates of those distances. So it's a fairly simple matter then to just come over to your contact point section and plug in your data. So you just copy paste your data, your Y data, your X data, and your Z data right into your contact point information. So that's basically how you go about getting precise data, whether it's and you have to be in select and move in order to get these coordinates. You won't get them on the select only. So select and move gives you exact coordinates. For example, here on the prop. What Flight Sim is wanting here under general engine data for the engine is actually the prop thrust position. Prop thrust position, not the engine position or the weight of the engine position, that, as you might think. It wants the prop thrust. So you can see I copied this data, excluding the little foot tick there, minus 10.479, and paste it right in here. So my Y data goes into my Y slot here, my X data into my X slot, and my Z data into my Z slot. So YXZ and XYZ. It's a little confusing, but that's just the way it works. Okay. So that's how we get the proper coordinates in Gmax to plug into the config. So then it's just a matter of copy and pasting data. You go around the aircraft, get the data that you want, and plug it right in. Then you know you have accurate data. So let's take a look at the aircraft config here on the right of the screen. Remember when we did an export a few videos back, we set up these sections of the Flight Sim .0 section, and we were able to export and get the aircraft to show in Flight Sim. Most aircraft has more than one Flight Sim section, so there's a couple things to keep in mind when you go to select an aircraft in Flight Sim. Oops. These are the things that help you find it. The manufacturer, is it Boeing, is it Douglas, is it whatever? In this case it's Vultee. UI type is the second item, because you may have different types of this aircraft, different models or whatever. And the third is the variation, which is typically just a a livery change on many of the aircraft. So, and when you have variations like this by livery, you also need to change the title to also identify that, because that shows up in the display, and it needs to be used as a differentiator from the other flight sim section. So a combination of this and this, and of course if it's a different livery, you're going to have a different texture name here. So that's the basics of that. Now let's come down and take a look at, these are the things, the data that we would collect in the weight and balance section. We get the reference datum position and the empty weight center of gravity. I always make this all zeros at the start. This would represent the crosshairs in Gmax. And as we discussed before, I always set my aircraft at 25% mean aerodynamic position, which is 25% back from the leading edge, and we're talking the root edge here, not the wing out here. If you had a swept wing aircraft like a modern jet, of course, you can't. I mean, where you have to place this is at the 25% of the root, where right at the aircraft. So that's what we've got here. And to keep things simple and non-confusing, as a starting point in setting up your aircraft config, if you just set your reference datum here, your empty weight center of gravity here, it makes everything quite simple. Now, if you have real data from an aircraft that you're using to construct, ribs and cross sections and what have you, and if you want to move this reference datum position out to the nose of the bulkhead, that's fine. You change it right here. But keep in mind, it kind of makes the rest of the numbers, will have to be changed to represent a change in this forward position. So, easy way to start out if you don't have all that manufacturer's data. I mean, typically they don't give you lights, and they may or may not give you, they definitely won't give you crash points, and they may or may not give you thrust location. So to me, we may as well just set it up this way, at least once you get the aircraft constructed and thinking about getting it to the sim. I'd recommend then going ahead and position the aircraft at 25% Mach and keep it all simple. Center of gravity and the reference point being the same place. There'd be no confusion. Okay, with that said, let's just do a couple examples here. Pilot position. I don't have a pilot in here, so I kind of had to wing it. So, your pilot, what we're looking at in station load 0 is usually the pilot. And it doesn't have to be, but that's usually what people do. And if you got co-pilot, station load 1 would be the co-pilot. In this case, I don't. So I used 400 pounds here. Actually, the weight is over here. I'm not sure what this. So since I don't have a pilot, what you do is kind of put your mouse in select and move. Put your mouse about where the pilot's mass would be. So it would be, center body mass would probably be about here. So you look at your data at the bottom, the XYZ data. Since this is a single pilot aircraft, of course, X is going to be 0. Y is 6.226. So right here is where you put in 6.226. Take that off. 8 feet forward. Well, I don't know. I lost that. Forward is 6 point. Okay, we got forward. Left, right, in this case, would be 0 because he's sitting in the center of the aircraft. And vertically, plus or minus, we'd say about 1.133 feet. So you can either copy or paste this in, or you can just type it. 1.6 feet. That's good enough. And this weight is 200 pounds. As far as the station load I had here, that station load in this aircraft was for 4 cannons, 2 machine guns, and all the ammunition rounds that are located here. And we're just going to put this kind of center mass, and we'll stick it at on the y-axis 14.212. So we'll select 14.212 for fore aft, and left right we'll put that as center of the aircraft, and vertically we just say it's at the center. We're good to go there. Okay, and with that, let's go down to views. Same deal with views. I don't have a pilot sitting here. Usually what I would do is, once the pilot is in, is select the vertice on the pilot's nose right between the 2 eyes, and I'd get the exact coordinates. So you can see the y coordinates is 6.33 feet. So that's close enough for now. And vertically somewhere around 2.885, so I already had that in there. And of course left right coordinate is going to be 0, so we're good to go on views. Fuel wise, if you have a left and right main tank, and actually this I don't know what this has because I don't have any data on it, so we're assuming that the fuel tanks are in right in this area on each side, so a left main and a right main, and they're going to be at or very close to 25% Mach and center of gravity. So if you just kind of point your cursor there and select and move mode, there's your coordinates for your, so y-wise we could be at 0, so look at y-wise would be at 0, and then left to right would be in the neighborhood of 4.7 to 5 feet. I just plugged in 5 here, and up down we want to be at or near 0, right on the balance of the aircraft, if you will. Could be a foot above, a foot below. Don't really know. It's probably a foot below in this case, just looking at the aircraft, but that's fine too, just -1 on each of those. So that's kind of what you do there. Since we don't have an exact drawing of where those are, you can only kind of wing it, and when in doubt, just put it at or near the center of gravity. Okay, let's go for the engine, which is actually the prop thrust location over here on the let's get the coordinates for that. The y coordinates is 10.479, which I've plugged in here. X left right is at 0, or should be, and vertically we're showing 5.68, so that's what we have plugged in here, so we're good to go. Let's see, before we do contact points, let's drop down the lights. Let's region zoom in here to lights. You see the lens to the nav light here. Once you select it, assuming that you have taken care to back pivot only, center the object, line the world, yada yada yada, then that coordinate is going to be exactly what you need. On the y coordinate 489, the x coordinate 28.872, and vertically the z coordinate 0.031. I've already plugged those in here. Okay, so that's how you go about collecting all that data and getting it right, so that when you go into flight sim, you know that you're going to be very close to smack on, if not right on, when you fire up the sim. And in terms of weight and balance, if you set it up the way I've described here, with respect to the center of the Gmax universe and 000 here, and when you go to the right side for a nose wheel aircraft, you'll see that the main gear is going to have to be behind the line here, the center of gravity, and the nose gear in front. Okay, if it were a tail dragger, it would be the other way. The main gear would be in front, and the tail wheel would be back. So you got to have balance. So all your weight is sitting primarily, most of your weight, about 80–85% of your weight is sitting on your main gear. So you're only carrying about 15–20% of your weight on your nose gear, and that's the way it should be. Okay, so when you go in the sim with these figures, and assuming that you get the contact point numbers correctly, identifying these where they are, then everything should come in balance. Your aircraft is not going to fall backwards as long as you got the weight distributed the way it should be and the contact points identified as they are shown in Gmax. So we touched on this earlier, but if you select the vertice, see if we got the bottom one here. Okay, and if you kind of look around, we've got the bottom center of the gear, and that's what we want. So right there is where we want. So now that we're in selected move mode, we have those coordinates. So if we come up to contact points in main gear, you'll see my 10 x left right is 10.915. On the left side it's a minus, on the right side it's a plus. Okay, and then forward aft is we're behind the center of gravity by 0.961. So here we are behind the center of gravity, 0.961, both cases. So, and then vertically on the z-axis, 8.719 feet. That's what we have over here. So we're good to go there. Now let's talk about, for a moment, the next parameter out here, which is the 1.587. This is actually the wheel radius, as you'll see up here in parameter 6. Wheel radius. So that's telling you right at a glance this tire is more than 3 feet tall. It's about 37 inches tall or 38 inches tall. So the wheel radius goes in here. If you don't know what that is, just go over here to helpers and grab your tape measure, and you can measure that like so. This will give you your diameter, which is 3.407, and half of that, if I were more accurate, should equal the 1.587 I'm showing here. So, and maybe it's not, that might be an old number I had in there, but you get the point. So let's knock that off, or you could just go ahead and measure the radius as it asks for. Might want to get in closer to this to get more accurate, but radius there, you can see to the right, is 1.737. So I think in this model I made the tire a little bit bigger than I did in the original one, which is where some of this data came from. So 1.737 is where this, what should be in the slot, 737. And what are the implications of getting this number wrong? If it's close, you probably won't notice it, but if it's way off, like if you put in diameter or whatever instead, you'll notice that your tire is rolling too fast for your speed on the ground, or is rolling too slow for your speed on the ground. So FS determines your rotation speed based on this number right here, so it's very important. Okay, and you do the same thing for the nose gear up here. So let's scrap the tape there and right click to get off tape. Same thing with the nose gear, just zoom in on it and select the vertice in the center of the tire and plug in your numbers. Okay, get your diameter. Notice this parameter here, which is the steering angle, number 7 up here in degrees. I've got 180 here because that makes it a castrine wheel, and that is the steering is controlled by differential braking or differential power, or both, combination. If you don't want that, of course, you can change it to rudder pedal controlled steering. Just plug in anywhere from 35 to 45 in there, and that will work as well. All right. So let's see, center of gravity height. This is the distance from the ground to the reference point when on the tarmac. So to start out with, just use your main gear vertical distance here. Just use that number right there. That's a starting point, and that's going to be a little off. It's going to set the aircraft high because this number assumes that the gear is hanging when it's not compressed, like when you're in landing configuration coming in on final. So in actuality, we have compressed this gear like 70% of its total animated movement. So it's going to be closer to the uncompressed than it is the hanging gear. So anyhow, it would be a little bit off, but you can change that tweak it as you get it into the sim, and you can actually calculate that number by doing what we did to calculate static and max to static ratio, and static compression, max to static ratio. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute here. Okay, let's see. Let's go to zoom back out here. And do we have any other points? Well, oh yeah, crash points. So you know how to set up your center of gravity height, center of static pitch rather. You can set this at 0 initially until you get an angle on how the aircraft is sitting with all the compression in play. There's a couple of tools out there. AFSD is one of them that gives you all this information, plus information about your control surfaces and aerodynamic data in general, and your engine specs, horsepower and prop speed, and all the other things that are going on. There's tools like that out there, and once you get in the sim, you can use those tools to set this, or what we're talking about is when you are in slew mode, and take it out of slew mode, you want the pitch to be somewhat close to what it's going to be when it's on the ground. So all you have to do is adjust this number up or down to try to get your aircraft so it's not sitting at a flat angle and then settling on a 2 or 3 degree angle. It kind of bounces around when you do that. So that and the center of gravity height above the ground can be tweaked as you're in the sim. But as long as you start out with these numbers here, here, and start at around 0 here, you're going to be fine. It'll load up just fine. And coming out of slew mode as well, it'll settle into your suspension really nicely. Okay, lights we talked about. Scrape points was the other thing I wanted to touch on. Just the same way as you're doing everything else here. Scrape points. Set up 3 here, left and right wing tips, and the tip of the nose. And usually you do one for the tail as well. And all you have to do is find the position on the aircraft that you want to place that at. And I selected vertex right here as kind of a good point, center line to the aircraft, and not too high on the nose and not too low. So just get those coordinates, plug it into your scrape points or crash points, whatever you want to call them, and you'll be good to go there. Same thing with the wingtips. What I did on the wingtips was just copy the lights coordinates, because it's basically kind of the outside leading edge of the wing. So if you're going to hit a building or something, that's what's going to key it right there. So with the wing, and of course you could do You could do one for the tail section here too, or two of them, but I'd probably do one here on the low end, so when you're rotating, if you rotate too hard, and the tail hits the runway, you'll hear it. And what are you going to hear? Well, when you set up these scrape points, this number right here, you have to get to the SDK to this column right here identifies the kind of sound you're going to hear. Is it a left wing scrape, a right wing scrape? Is it a nose scrape or hit? Is it a tail scrape? And it kind of sets that sound cone so that it's coming from your right, left, front, or rear. So that's what that's all about. Okay. Let's now talk about setting up your suspension, and try to keep this simple, and it's really not too bad, but you have to, it takes a little while sometimes to get it to sink in. Remember, our suspension is animated from frames 100 to 200, 100 to 200, and we talked a little bit about that total distance of suspension. Now, in order for your suspension to look right, work right, and seem realistic, you need to do these numbers correctly. And the numbers I'm talking about, of course, are these sets of numbers here in both nose gear and main gear. And what we're talking about, in addition, and to get that right, is, let me get this, we'll go here, is, and we talked about it back when we animated this, is this total suspension movement here is key to everything, from 100 or 101 to 200. So remember, we captured, well, we didn't do it here. We captured that data when we go to vertex mode, and you select the center vertex, the lowest center vertex on that tire, and you capture that data. I think it's at 101 is where we animated this, maybe not, 100. You capture this data and you plug it in. 10, 9, 15 here is the fore aft, but the numbers we're concerned about is the z-axis, 8.719, this number right here, and this number right here. That is the gear hanging at 100. And if the gear weren't hanging, if it were fully compressed through our total animation, we get to this number, 7.811. 7.811 difference between that and 8719 is your total suspension movement. So you need to calculate that number, get that number, and record it, because it's through that number that we're going to calculate this data over here. Okay, let's see, let me pull up something here. Let's see, you cannot see that, so let's pull this to the left. Alright, we're talking about main gear, and we just talked about extending the gear, and we had these kinds of numbers for a total suspension animation of 909. Now, how do you go about setting up these factors in the aircraft config for, let's get this in screen here, how do we come up with this 556 and 1.50? Well, that's what we're going to talk about. For main gear, for best effect, to have your gear not too stiff and not too soft, what I usually use is a 66.6, 2/3 if you will, to 70% static compression. That is, of the total animation movement we have here between frames 100 and 200, that total animation distance I take 70% of that, or 2/3 of it, either way, and multiply that by your factor to get this number. So if I had 0.909 feet times 70% is 7 9s are 63. See, it comes out to 0.636. Okay? And then to account for the balance of that movement, I've got 70% of it here. I need to account for the other 30%. I plug that here. Now, how do I get that? I take that total movement, divide it by the factor I use, and that gives me 1.429. That's my maximum compression to static compression ratio. Does that make sense? I usually use 2/3 to 70%. If you use 2/3 here, which would be 0.667 rather, then your max static ratio is going to be 1.5. That's a good round number. You can remember it. So if you use 2/3 of this distance here, then your ratio will always be 1.5. Pretty simple, right? So what happens when you do this, your gear is going to have plenty of compression, static compression. It'll take bumps really well. It's not going to be harsh. It'll take gravel runways, grass strips, dirt runways, etc. All that very well. And when you land a little hard, it'll absorb that, and it won't give you a crash because you overstress the aircraft. It's almost essential that you do 70%, 75% even, for carrier-based aircraft. You need a lot of travel distance here, and you need a lot of static compression. The lower this number, the more stiff the suspension is. So, and an indication of that, if I only use, say, 20% of this number here, then probably what you'd get every time you landed is your tires would be chirping, and your ride would be bumpy, and your taxiing would be a little rough, would be bumpy. So especially on other than concrete runways or macadam runways. So I find 66 to 70% is the ideal sweet spot for static compression. So just whatever your total animation distance is, once you have that, by subtracting frame 200 from 100, 200 from 100 to get your total distance of animation, total suspension distance. Multiply it by your factor, and then based on what you're using, if you're using 70%, that's your factor. If you're using 2/3 or 66.667, that's going to be 1.5. If you use that factor, you'll probably never go wrong on 95% of the aircraft you're doing, including carrier-based or jets. So, same thing with the nose gear, except I use a different factor. Total suspension movement. You want your nose gear to be a little bit stiffer and stay more extended. Typically, I want the factor to be 2.5. So I take this total suspension movement here, and 2.5 represents 40% of the movement. And this 2.5 should really be, well, it is. It's here. This would really be 0.40. 40% is what I want there. So if you just multiply your 0.548, or divide it, by 40, and you get your max static. That's not right. Why I plugged that in there? This is supposed to be 2.5. Duh. Okay, so I'm using a 40% compression rate. So 40%. I don't know what that number is. I set up this spreadsheet, and I must have blown the, oh, okay. the way I calculated that. But anyhow, 40% of your total movement would be about 0.2. What do I do here anyhow? Divided by, no, it should be times. Duh. Alright, there you go, 0.219. So total movement times 0.40 gives you 219. And then if you divide your total compression by 219, you should get 2.5. Let's see if we do. I'm just grabbing my trusty calculator to test myself out here. By 0.4, I get 1.37. Then something must be wrong here. Anyhow, I'm confusing myself here under the pressure of the video, so no problem. I do it all the time, actually. So I want that to be 0.4%. That's 219. That's correct. So if I multiply, then I'm sorry, 0.219 times 2.5, I get 5.475. So it rounds up to 5.48. So that's correct. Jeez. So here, this is a key, and how your aircraft is going to be on ground handling, how it's going to sit statically, how it's going to handle landing, particularly harsh landings like on aircraft carriers. If you'll use these factors, total suspension movement times either 2/3 or 70%. 70% goes with this. If you use 2/3, 0.667, it'd be 1.5 here. Then you'll be good to go. Damping, or dampening, which is it? I don't know. Anyhow, generally either 0.9 or 1 is good for you there. So let's see if here we go. I had this information up here earlier. Suspension setup points, key for, we talked about this, it's really important that the suspension movement in Gmax exactly equals what you identify over here, and that's why we're going through this regimen here, is to ensure that it matches. Otherwise, you're going to have aircraft or suspension that's sinking in the ground when it's not supposed to, and what have you. If you do it using this technique, your tires will all be sitting precisely on the tarmac. So that's what you want. And we talked about damping. You know, I usually use 1.0 for the nose gear, and either 0.9 or 1 for the main gear. It just depends. The softer you go here, the more roll and the more the less stiffness you have in recovery from a roll or from a bounce. Generally, I go with 0.9 or 1 based upon the kind of landings I'm going to be doing with this aircraft. If it's particularly if it's a short takeoff and landing aircraft and you're landing short runways, whatever, you're going to want at least a 0.9 to a 1 to keep from the bounce. If you plan it with a 1.0, you know, it's going to stick when you hit, assuming that center of gravity and all the other things are correct. You're going to hit, you're going to stick, and that's what you want. You don't want to be bouncing around a lot. So that's what that's all about. So I hope this kind of clears up. I know it's kind of helter-skelter, but at least you get the advantage of listening to it multiple times and being as confused as I am sometimes. And sometimes it's easy to talk about, and sometimes it's not. So it depends on the time of day and how much coffee I've had. So just a word to the wise, get that suspension right. It's really key in the way aircraft looks and handles, and whether or not it's going to break the gear when you land too hard. If you set it up the way I've described, it'll work just beautifully. So I hope this has been some help to you. And let's try to end up here with a note about we've completed the exterior of the aircraft. We've exported it, got it into the flight sim correctly, and so far we're doing a great job. I wanted to do this whole data transfer thing, but there's a lot of people who have trouble with that, understanding it, and how to do it and where to get your numbers. Well, now that you're building your own aircraft, there's no mystery to it. You just take it right out of Gmax and plug it in, and you don't have to worry about it. You know it's going to be accurate when it gets there. And if you do all this correctly, you won't have a problem with aircraft flipping and flopping and bouncing around with you. In flight sim, as a lot of people have that trouble trying to correct other people's setup, and it's just very difficult to do if you don't have access to the real data like you do when you have the model in hand. So that's very important. So I hope we've achieved our objectives here as stated, and just keep in mind these points right here, as they are absolutely critical to good suspension setup, and you'll be very happy with the results. And just make sure that anytime you change the static compression, the max static ratio, that you need to make sure that your total animation number does not change. So if you always just multiply static compression times the ratio, that should give you the total suspension animation. If it doesn't, then something's messed up and your animation will not look right or function correctly. And you can always change the static compression as you wish, and then in order to figure out what the new ratio should be, just divide your total suspension by your static compression to get your new ratio, and you'll be good to go. So there we have it, folks. Now that we've completed the exterior aircraft and getting the aircraft in the sim the way we want to, I'm not going to take you into flight model development until later on in the series, but before we move on to the virtual cockpit, I guess the question I have is, should we go into mapping now or wait till later? I usually map the exterior when I have it finished and before I go into the interior, and then map the interior later, but some people like to do it while they're building parts, and that's particularly true if you're building for FSX. You kind of want to build and map and then animate later. In FS9, I typically build and animate and then map later, and that's perfectly acceptable. But because FSX and the way it works, you need to do the process differently. So there are differences between FSX and FS9 development. So if you're developing for FSX, all the normal things we've done to construct the aircraft are fine the way you've learned them here. When you get into animation and texturing, things are different because you have animation manager. I forget the proper name at the moment, but and it's important the sequence that you do things when animation is involved. So just keep that in mind if you plan to develop for Flight Sim X or FSX. Okay, so I'll decide between now and the next video whether I move on to UVW mapping so we can texture this aircraft, or whether I'll just move right into the virtual cockpit construction. So hopefully this video has been some help to you, and if you have any comments or questions, post them below and I'll try to address them. Thanks guys for sticking with us this far, and I hope it helps you become a better modeler. Have a good day.